Hello, everybody. Almost 4 years ago, actually exactly 4 years ago, in May 2021, I had a show with the writer Tim Jackson, teaches at the University of Surrey in England, on the incompatibility of capitalism and love. Jackson had just come out with a book called Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, and he has become, according to the New Republic, a celebrity with his anti-growth pitch. He's described as a British economist, but I'm not sure I would necessarily describe him purely as an economist. Perhaps he's a critic of traditional economics. Anyway, Tim has a new book out. It's called The Care Economy, and he's joining us from Surrey, where he lives, just on the border of Surrey and Hampshire. Tim, congratulations on the new book. Would you describe yourself as an economist? What word would you use to describe your work?
I have a home in what's now called ecological economics, but it's quite an eclectic mix of people, and for sure, I'm not the most conventional economist in the country. In fact, I don't tend to be called an economist in the UK. I tend to be called all sorts of other names, but I am quite often referred to as the British economist who critiques growth in a lot of other places.
I'm not sure if I want to embarrass you, and I'm sure you're not particularly proud of being described as a celebrity, but someone has to be, Tim, don't they? I mean, this is a message, your message, and you're not alone, of course, here. There's a very fertile audience for what you're saying. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think celebrity is a little bit overdrawn, to be honest. It was very nice of Nick to describe me in those terms, but there was a moment, and it came after the first of these critiques of growth was published in actually 2009, when it was, and that was a kind of moment which actually did change my life. I came from sort of a relatively obscure position in a provincial university. I was working for a government advisory body at that point in time, and out of that work came a book called Prosperity Without Growth. And the fame of Prosperity Without Growth was certainly partly because it was an advisor to a government.
Right, and the subtitle of that book is Foundations for the Economy of Tomorrow. So again, a little bit of economics there, but maybe an anti-economics economics.
Yeah, I mean, I was appointed actually in this role as the economics commissioner. So I was kind of, whatever I am, the UK government saw fit to think of me as an economist at that point in time, and then probably regretted the decision afterwards.
One of the books that was shortlisted last year for the Financial Times Book of the Year was from Daniel Susskind, who was on the show. I'm sure you're familiar with his book, Growth, A History and a Reckoning. He tries to sort of walk a line between traditional economics and critics like yourself. But how would you, Tim, define this broad debate, which you're a leading figure in this issue of economic growth?
I think I would describe it as a dilemma, actually, and I think in that book, Susskind also describes it as a dilemma. And
did you like the book? Did you agree with him?
No, I thought. I mean, to me, I did and I didn't. I kind of it always annoys me in a sense when conventional economists come to this discussion sort of in this kind of slightly tentative way, with the underlying assumption that we have to hold on to economic growth come what may. And then all of their arguments kind of revolve around this underlying assumption that we have to keep economic growth. And what's particularly odd to me about that is that we're living at a time when economic growth is more and more difficult to come by, and the bits of economic growth it looks like we might be able to get are damaging either to the society or to the planet itself. And so that's the context in which I think I want economists to be a little more brave, not quite so timid, not towing the line around economic growth so much. But that doesn't stop it being something which is a real and very profound dilemma. And I set that out, very clearly in that report to the UK government, that yes, growth is causing all this damage, but We've organized all of our society around growth. Our economies work through growth. We're dependent on growth for the stability of our institutions and our financial system. So this is a place where actually we have to think pretty clearly about those institutions, those structures, the economy as a whole. And we can't just take easy solutions for granted. We can't just sort of go, well, we've always relied on growth, so we're going to get growth back somehow, because that isn't obvious at all. Neither can we say we're just going to throw growth away and everything will be all right, because that wouldn't be true either when we're so dependent on it in such specific ways for the way that our economy works, the way society functions.
A couple of months ago, we had a real economist, a sort of a hardcore economist, Diane Coyle. I'm sure you're familiar, from Cambridge University. She has a new book out, which I think is probably something you're sympathetic with, called The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. Do you think economists like Coyle are right to challenge, and this is a softball question for you, Tim, traditional notions of GDP, the traditional metrics that economists used in the 20th century?
Yes, I do. In fact, to me, that's kind of where I came at it originally. I was involved in the construction of a kind of alternative index, an alternative to the GDP back in the early 2000s, I suppose it was, late 1990s, actually. An index which goes now under the name Genuine Progress Indicator. And at the time, it was called
GPI,
the index.
I guess.
GPI, exactly. At the time, I think it was called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, and it was put together by Herman Daly, who passed away a couple of years ago, who was a kind of pioneering ecological economist, actually. And it was a way of sort of saying, look, if you measured what really matters, as Diane Coyle is asking us to do, you would come up with a very different picture of how we're doing. It looks like, and it looked like at the time, that GDP was going up and up and up. If you looked at the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, it was going up to a certain point, and then it was kind of plateauing, and sometimes it was even coming down, so that our real welfare, our genuine progress, doesn't necessarily have the same shape as the GDP does.
Tim, you couldn't have come up with a fuzzier word than caring. I looked it up online. Displaying kindness and concern for others. So is the notion of a care economy, is it a contradiction in terms, in the sense that economics and economy is rooted in some sort of quantification, but how do you quantify a word like care?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a tricky thing to quantify. My goal in talking about care, and maybe it's worth just sort of describing this a little bit.
Please, yes.
Was not so much in terms of, are we measuring the right thing? Could we measure something else? Although that does become important, but rather, what's the dynamic of care by comparison with the dynamic of economic growth? And actually, my starting point for that is to ask, what is prosperity? That was the question I asked in that government report. There was a lot of attention to the two words without growth, because that was a very challenging thing to think about. But the first part of the title of that book, Prosperity, demands some questioning as well. What actually is prosperity? And our conventional assumption that prosperity is pretty much the same thing as wealth. And as long as we increase our income, that'll increase our wealth. And so we can describe ourselves as being more and more prosperous, and growth will deliver that to us. But actually, the origins of the word prosperity are in the original Latin more general than that. So prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and our aspirations. Is our life in accordance with our hopes and our aspirations? What are those aspirations? And when you ask people, and we did quite a lot of asking around those early days with the Sustainable Development Commission work, what you find is that actually it isn't wealth so much as health that comes out as the top priority. If we don't have our health, then it doesn't really matter how rich we are. If our family doesn't have their health, our riches don't count for that much. If our community is not healthy, if our planet is not healthy, you might even say. And so, if prosperity is more about health than it is about wealth, then it sort of began to seem to me that the economy should be more about care than about growth. And for a very specific reason to do with the dynamics of health versus the dynamics of wealth. The dynamics of wealth is all about accumulation. It's about having more and more. It's about growth. So growth is the right way to get more and more, to accumulate that concept of wealth. But when you start to think about health, actually, and I'm starting from a very physiological point of view on this, health is not just about more and more. In fact, mainly in the human body or in any other organism, when you have more and more of something, it generally turns out badly for that body. And what health is about, rather, is about balance. The balance of certain chemicals in our blood, the balance of our blood sugar, the balance of our breathing rate, our heart rate, the balance of minerals in the body, the balance of dopamine in the brain. Almost everything in the concept of physiological health is about balance. And so the problematic aspect of a dynamic that pushes us towards more and more and more is that we don't notice that point of balance. And even when we get to it, actually, we're always going in the direction of more, so we find it impossible to stop. Care, on the other hand, and this was how I framed it really in the book, care is that attention to the point of balance that constantly asks us to restore that balance, to push back when it's a little bit too much, to push on when it's a little bit more, but to pay attention to that concept of the balance of health in our body, in our society, and indeed in the planet. And care, therefore, it ends up having a quite precise function as that process of the restoration of balance.
It sounds Aristotelian, although I'm not sure we necessarily, you mentioned antiquity, I'm not sure we live in a Aristotelian world. I wonder whether there's a broader critique here, Tim. All the metrics, and I know you're not a big metrics guy, but they all suggest that Europe is falling behind the US when it comes to these traditional economic metrics about wealth and money. And apparently Trump's tariffs may even impact European growth even more, compound all this. But are you offering an alternative economic reality, or perhaps anti-economic reality, to the one in the United States? Your book came out earlier this year in the UK, and in Europe it's out this week in the US. So is your book implicitly at least a critique of the American model?
It's a critique of the Anglo-centric model, in which, my own country has been sort of implicated, possibly for even longer than the US, but which is now being largely run and driven by the US. And that's a model which kind of thrives on the idea that more is always better. It's a model that thrives on the idea that, competition is the right way to achieve an optimal outcome. It thrives on the idea, actually, ultimately, of conflict, because that competition, particularly when it comes to competition for scarce resources, almost inevitably leads at some point towards conflict. And that's a sense, I suppose, in which, that warm, fuzzy aspect of care that you were referring to right at the beginning is a direct ethical opponent to the idea of kind of constant struggle that leads always to conflict. And this is the right way to progress. It's a confrontation of that ideology, certainly. And in that sense, it's a confrontation of the economy that thrives on that ideology and ultimately leads to conflict and destruction. It's a way of saying to ourselves, actually, wake up, because the direction of travel is taking us towards environmental destruction, it's taking us towards financial instability, it's taking us towards geopolitical conflict, it's taking us towards increasing inequality. None of this is restorative. None of this pays attention to the balance of health. None of it is care.
I take the point, Tim, and you've written about the politics in the UK, about calling for growth is not the same as delivering it. But some people might be listening, and I'm sure you deal with this criticism all the time. And some people might be listening and thinking, this is just the Camden Town way of thinking about the world. Most people need to put food on the table, need to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, send their kids to college, save enough to retire on. And for all your concern and respect for care, economics really matters. We saw it in the UK with the Brexit vote. You see it in general elections. Politicians, for better or worse, always seem to be hostage to these metrics. How would you respond to that critique that most people, when it comes down to it, really do care about their own personal prosperity?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I would disagree with what that prosperity means for people. Although, I suspect the question you're asking is money not the most important thing in people's lives? And to some extent, and particularly if you don't have it, of course it is within the economic structure that we live in. But it does seem to me that argument is also quite disingenuous. As part of the subject matter of the book, so it's kind of relevant to talk about it. But a part of the economy, a fairly basic part of the economy, is around food. You couldn't get more basic than that. And it remains the case that the poorest people in society, even in a rich economy like the UK or the US, cannot even afford to eat the sort of diet that we have at the moment. And yet, what's clear about that diet, and it's increasingly clear, it's more clear in relation to the poorest people's society than it is in the richest people's society, is that diet is unhealthy. It's a diet that has inadequate nutrition, inadequate fiber. It has too much refined sugar, too much salt, too much saturated fat. It's sold without the nutrients that actually keep the balance of the health of the body intact. And the only opposition to that seems to be to say, well, you Camden folks with your high ideals about healthy eating, you're not looking at that from the perspective of a poor household that's got, a single parent with a couple of kids who's trying to work 9 to 5 or 9 to 9, 2 jobs, and has absolutely no time to do anything than get enough money in and then eat fast food, which is an absolutely understandable argument. But it seems to be saying we should therefore consign the poorest people in the world to a level of health which is actually going to mean that they die sooner, have worse lives, suffer from chronic disease for the second half of their life, and have no aspiration or no access to decent, healthy food. And yet, and this is another point in the book, our failure to allow proper food, allow decent food, allow real food to be affordable to everyone, not just the Camden lobby, but to those poor households, is an economic failure, both at the level of the food industry and also at the level of the health industry. In fact, chronic disease, largely resulting from that poor diet, is now responsible for 3/4 of death worldwide. And it's also responsible for an increasingly unpayable healthcare bill, which we lavage mostly on the pharmaceutical industry, who's all too happy to sell us remedies to some of the symptoms of the chronic disease caused by the diet and lifestyle that's caused in its turn by a food industry that's out of control. Because all that works in the conventional economic sense. We have big food, we have big pharma, they both have huge profits, they both contribute to growth, that increases the GDP, and all of that is legitimized by this growth-based economy. And yet it's an entirely false economy. It's an economy built on monetizing our own neuropsychology to sell us foods that are irresistible, which then undermine our own health, and then selling us solutions, supposed solutions, which introduce more toxins into the body, fail to solve the underlying causes, and ultimately also can end up making us sicker at best and highly dependent on very expensive healthcare at worst. That, to me, when I look at that, I see not an economics that's in control of itself, not an economics that's anywhere aligned with prosperity, but a concept of a totally false economy, something that Herman Daly, who we talked about before, would call uneconomic growth. Because essentially, yes, it looks like growth when you measure it by GDP, but actually, ultimately, it's undermining the things that matter most to us. The goods that the economy is supposed to deliver have turned into bads, and those bads are becoming not just unpayable, but actually undermining the very basic aspects of our own prosperity like health. That's the extent, to me, of the dysfunctionality of the existing system.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that the intimacy between what you call big pharma, big food, is proven by these new generation of anti-obesity drugs, GLP, which only addicts people to these types of drugs, which are very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, it is a kind of interesting point in time in a way, because the existence of these drugs, which to me are actually, in physiological terms, in economic terms, and in terms of the health of the body, are a bit of an abomination, I have to say. Nonetheless, it is an interesting moment in time, because the pharmaceutical industry finds itself in competition with the food industry for the revenues that are available from the process of living, if you like. So, if the pharmaceutical industry is successful with its Ozempic, Mounjaro trials, its rolling out of anti-obesity drugs, its hooking of healthcare systems as on these drugs as the only way of managing food intake, diet, and chronic disease, if it's successful, that will have an impact on the food industry. So to some extent, for the first time, we've actually got a pharmaceutical industry and a food industry that are slightly at odds with each other. And, if the typical pattern of reconciliation of those kinds of differences works out, we'll probably find ourselves in a situation where, for the interest of the pharmaceutical industry, we'll continue to be able to sell these drugs, but for the interest of the food industry, we'll find other ways of making our food irresistible and find other markets for selling it. And none of that will constitute a care economy. It's still an economy that's essentially fighting over the possibilities for growth between two big players that consistently between them undermine our health.
So what advice would you give individuals, Tim? I take your point on this broader kind of philosophical element, but for people who are overweight, who have been struggling all their lives, who are addicted to big food, whose lives mean that they struggle to lose weight, to become healthy, these new drugs are available that allow them to lose weight, but they themselves are addictive in the sense that if you go off them, then your weight balloons again. What advice would you give individuals?
I'm not in the process of giving individual health advice. So maybe the best thing to do is to kind of explore it from my own perspective, because one of the things that happened in the process of writing the book, which was a little bit left field, was that I was suddenly diagnosed with diabetes, one of these chronic diseases, a chronic disease that is intimately related to the way that I was eating, to the food that I was eating. And it turned out, in the process of me exploring what was going on, I'm an addict. I'm a sugar addict. Not surprising, because we're all pretty much close to that line of addiction, because our brains evolved at a time when sugar was immensely scarce, and so we are programmed to seek it out. We get a huge dopamine response, particularly those of us who are more susceptible to sugar than others, and that is a way of indicating to our body, to our brain, to our behaviors that we should pursue this thing called sugar. That evolutionary environment has completely changed, of course, and we're now in the hands of an environment and in the hands of people who have figured out that neuropsychology is immensely profitable. We're in the hands of a food industry that has put sugar and refined carbs in as much as it can. So when I discover that I am diabetic, pre-diabetic at first, and then later diabetic, I go out and I look at what I'm going to eat, because I don't, the doctor says to me, would you like to take a drug? We can find a drug. And I say, well, I'm not too keen on the idea of taking a drug for the rest of my life. What else can I do? And she says, you can, look at your diet a little bit. And so I read a little bit. I look at what I need to reduce. And then I go out and I walk into a supermarket and I look around me and I say, what the hell? There is virtually nothing here that I can eat, because everything's got added sugar in it. And then, the two lessons out of that, really, for me, one is that it's very, very difficult at the individual level to do anything. But the second is that it's not totally impossible at the individual level I did then sort of say, well, obviously I'm not going to be doing that much shopping in supermarkets, or I'm going to be very selective about what I buy in supermarkets. I actually have to reconstruct my diet more or less from scratch to take out the added sugar, to minimize the trans fats, to increase the fiber, the nutrients that I'm eating. And I suppose partly because I was in the middle of writing a book, it was an incredibly interesting project to do. So my first lesson is, yes, at the individual level, you can do that. But the second is, it's incredibly difficult to do. And at the public policy level, it is totally heroic, almost absurd to think that you can solve what's becoming a public health crisis by appealing to individual change. So the change that I'm advocating, yes, take what you can, if you can, take agency where you can, if you can, and make those changes, because ultimately you are the person who has the most agency in relation to the health of your own body. But you will find it difficult. And at the population level, we can't expect everyone to have the resources, the energy, the time, the persistence, the determination to do that. We actually have to address the dynamics of that underlying system, a system in which human beings were evolved in one environment, and we are creating an environment that is quite specifically unsafe for those organisms because they are programmed to abuse it. And they're programmed to abuse it in pursuit of the profit of a minority of people who will have dividends and shares in an industry that is undermining our health. And that's a systemic problem. It's not something you can sort of, I or anybody else can turn around and say to you or to anybody listening, yeah, okay, too bad, you've been diagnosed with high blood sugar, you better go out and, fix this for yourself. And ultimately, it is very, very difficult if you're heavily embedded in that system to do that without some help from the medical profession,
Right. It's
from the
interesting
food
that,
industry, and from the government.
Yeah, I mean, some doctors are advising people with diabetes to take these new GLP drugs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the interesting things there, and there's now a kind of a little bit of a difficulty in relation to them, is that people who are really sick, people with type 1 diabetes, for example, people who, as you said, obese to a point where they are unable to control their own diet, their own eating. These are the places where you would want a responsible medical profession to be prescribing those kinds of solutions, even if it's short term, alongside programs which teach people how to eat differently, how to resist those temptations. But actually, they're not being used quite in that way because they have now become a market. There's a little bit of scarcity involved there. There's quite a high cost. So typically, they're now being used as a kind of lifestyle drug by those who can afford to use them, and therefore are less available to people who have really serious medical conditions in which they're absolutely needed. So it's another dynamic of the problem.
Yeah, not the first or the last time with that problem. You've been critical of the British government for its focus on growth. We've done lots of shows on the regenerative movement, regenerative economics, regenerative agriculture. Is there a need for a political movement that brings all these pieces together, Tim? I mean, the Greens in Europe had their moment in the last part of the 20th century, but is there a need for an alternative way of packaging up these ideas? Maybe, if not a green party, a regenerative movement of one kind or another that deals with agriculture and economics and eating and all these other things that you focus on in the care economy?
Yes, I think there is. And, it's struggled in the sense that we've had various incarnations, various iterations to try to create such a movement. Some of it has focused probably a little bit too precisely on the idea of economic growth versus what's sometimes called degrowth or post-growth. Some of it which is focused on the limits of the planet, which of course seem very far away when you're a poor household struggling to live. And actually, interestingly now, quite a lot that does focus around the idea of health. And I think it's another reason in a way for thinking in these terms now, because health is something which convenes all of our interest. Everybody has an interest in health, their own health, the health of their families. It's a place where actually that argument about regeneration begins to make sense, not in a kind of elite way, not in a kind of Camden way, but actually in a way that everybody can relate to. So it's quite possible, that is a convening point. That's a place where actually we can bring all of those ideas together, whether we call it regenerative or not, whether we call it Make America Healthy Again, whether we call it, post-growth economics. It's got to go beyond a sort of carving up of the territory in terms of words. It's got to have something which captures public imagination, and health is one of those things that captures public imagination.
Are there politicians who in your mind are addressing this? I mean, Bobby Kennedy in the 60s questioned the idea of GDP as the ultimate determinant of national health. His son, RFK Jr., of course, is the man behind making, in his language, making America healthy again. Is he the problem, RFK Jr., or is he one example of somebody who's certainly not perfect, but beginning to address these issues?
Yeah, no, I mean, in Post-Growth, which we talked about last time we spoke, I started that book with RFK Sr., and I started with it for that.
Yeah, I remember.
Reason that, that story, he turns up in 1968, in the year of that ill-fated political campaign, in which he would probably, almost certainly, have become president if he hadn't been assassinated. He turns up at the first event in his campaign and talks about the failings of the GDP. And I've been fascinated by that incident. I've always been fascinated by it and by the roots of it, what was driving in him. And he was driven by all sorts of things. He was driven by, looking at people around the country and discovering degrees of poverty, some of which were about income, but also a lot of which was around dignity and purpose and meaning and having a decent life. And some of it also was about the impact that we're having through our pursuit of the GDP on the planet. And in RFK Sr., all of these things came together in that, and in particular were articulated so clearly in that speech at Kansas University in March 1968, I think it was, to be absolutely precise.
About, 4 or 5 months before he was assassinated in
Exactly.
Los Angeles.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and looking at history, asking what if is not a particularly productive thing to do, and sometimes
he had that famous
in
that speech, didn't he have that famous interaction with some students in the audience when he said that essentially there were no easy answers and that the students would have to pay for this improved world, that he wasn't just going to promise them stuff for nothing?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the interactive element there, but he didn't certainly argue that this was a simple, trivial thing to do. He didn't argue that there were easy solutions. What he did in the speech, and it was, and he made this case very clearly in one of the quotes that he used, is that, he didn't want to lay waste to the entire territory and then call that progress. And that does entail, to avoid doing that, does entail making some sorts of effort, some sorts of, not necessarily sacrifice, but at least making a choice between something which will lay waste the territory and something which will preserve that territory for future generations, that will preserve it for those less fortunate in the world at the moment. And so it was a critique based, actually informed by his own values about the wilderness, about the environment, and indeed about social society and the social fabric. But it came, of course, at a time when some of the pernicious aspects of that growth still hadn't really played themselves out. So in that question that we were talking about of food, for example, the food system in the 1960s when he was talking was nothing like the food system that subsequently developed over the next few decades. It was not causing so much damage. And yet what we know in the decades intervening, in the decades between RFK Sr. and RFK Jr., is that food system is a part of what is undermining our prosperity, undermining our health, undermining the conditions of life of ordinary, and in particular of very poor people. And to preside over that with a sort of assumption that it doesn't matter, or that we can't afford to do any better, is precisely wrong, I think. And it's precisely wrong in the way that RFK Jr., for all his faults, as you say, has begun to point out. And he's begun to point it out through a campaign that has been driven by mothers, by women, concerned about a pandemic of chronic disease that is inflicted on their children as a result of a food system that is making us all sick. And so there is something that connects father and son. There is something that suggests that actually a concern for justice, a concern for an economy that works, a concern for a food system that isn't destroying our health, that has to be in itself a good thing. Whether it's weaponized in the wrong way, whether it's part of a politics that we agree with or disagree with, is neither here nor there, it seems to me, because many, many people behind RFK Jr. and in the United States, in Europe, many people with medical backgrounds are actually saying very much the same thing, that we're living in a dysfunctional food system that's undermining our health. If we care about our health, we should change those things. Changing those things means confronting some of the power that we've given over to big industrial lobbies in the name of economic growth. There's a line of continuity, as I see it, between RFK Senior and RFK Junior.
Certainly an interesting, controversial line, maybe a dotted line. As I said earlier, Tim, you become a celebrity with your anti-growth pitch, and the care economy will no doubt add to that celebrity. Are you concerned, though, that this kind of book and this kind of argument will be embraced by fringe groups, the anti-vaxxers, who will embrace the idea of care? Are there people that you don't want to appreciate the care economy? What's your take on the anti-vaxxer movement, who, of course, are very close to RFK Jr.?
I am concerned. Of course, I'm concerned. And I think it's also of concern, and it's not a part of my argument, that the medical system as a whole is wrong. The medical system can claim for itself substantial victories and has done so. And many of those victories have relied on pharmaceutical interventions. And in many cases, the development of pharmaceutical interventions has profoundly improved the quality of life for people who would have had a very short life. So I think it's really important to say that right at the center of this. And yet a part of what I did in the book was to tease out the history of the development of this medical system on which we now rely, and to argue that in getting to that point where the pharmaceutical industry is the center point of our medical system, we have created a kind of over-medicalized view of care, an over-medicalized view of health. And what I did in the book actually was to go back and look at the starting point of that and say, where did that happen? What else could our healthcare system have been? And finding, in fact, a view of health which has more to do with care, that has more to do with nursing than pharmaceuticals, that has more to do with the conditions of our lives than the interventions that we've begun to take for granted. And my position is not to say, therefore, let's get rid of all these interventions. It's not to say there's no room for pharmaceuticals. It's not to give way to extremist positions, which are, essentially, potentially quite dangerous. It's to say, when we threw away that other way of thinking about health, we threw away the baby with the bathwater. We threw away a set of principles which we desperately need now, particularly in the context of chronic disease, because the pharmaceutical solutions, which were so good with infectious diseases, are not able to tackle what's coming at us through a series of chronic diseases, which are all about our lifestyle, the terrain of the physical body, rather than its invasion by a specific germ. And that argument between germ theory and terrain theory, which occupied quite a lot of medicine over 150 years or so, actually has become destructive to an integrated functional model of health in which we combine the power of pharmaceuticals and these actually relatively simple lifestyle changes that will bring us back to health, that will care for our physical organism and bring it back to a point of balance. And that, I guess, ultimately, fundamentally, is the argument that I'm making in the book.
One of the chapters of the book is called, it's the 12th chapter, Fuck the Patriarchy. We're allowed to swear on this show, Tim. We did a show last week, actually, with John Cassidy. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He's just come out with a new book, Capitalism and Its Critics. And one of the chapters in the book, and we talked about this, was focused on Silvia Federici and her idea of female labor and love as unpaid labor. How does the Federici argument about, if you like, quantifying female labor fit into your arguments in the care economy?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I probably should have said this straight up, and I do in the book. The process of writing the book was cathartic for me in some ways, because it confronted me with my own gender. And when I began to look at, the literature around care and the literature around the people who give care, caregivers, care workers, unpaid care, underpaid care, it became very clear that it was primarily women who were writing about that and have been writing about it for some time. And it was tricky, really, coming at this as a man and thinking, I'd come at it from a slightly independent point of view, but I'd come into what was, as Nancy Folber describes it, the land of the invisible heart. If Adam Smith is the land of the invisible hand, which makes everything right through the power of the market, the invisible heart is that thing that makes everything possible through the application of care, the labors of care, the labor of love, the bringing up of children, the nurturing of infants, the looking after of old people, the looking after of the sick, without which we would have no economy, no economic activity, no productivity at all. This thing, which is predominantly carried out by women, has gone basically neglected by mainstream economics. And that was a part of my book. And it was in that confrontation with myself around my own gender and talking about those things, I was also led to another, fascinating part of that, which is that whereas care is predominantly enacted by women, what's predominantly acted by men is violence. Most violence is enacted by men. Most violence is enacted by men on women. Some of that violence is state sanctioned, and some of it is coded into us when we are very, very young, and small boys are given guns and rifles while little girls are given a nurse's apron. And that is a division in society which has become, to my mind, as dysfunctional as all of those feminist economists, feminist writers have been telling us for decades, and has reached a point where I think it's kind of as much up to men to understand their own role in that and to figure out that care is something that belongs to all of us. It's not a gendered item. It's become gendered in a society which is profoundly patriarchal, but it's actually something which we have a right, all of us, men and women, to claim as the fundamental basis of what it means to be human. And without it, we risk destroying, not just some arbitrary small sector of the economy, which we label with care, but actually our economic integrity, our social fabric, and perhaps even the geopolitical stability of our world. These are the kinds of things that led me to sort of call that chapter what I feel it needs to be called: Fuck the Patriarchy.
Yeah, and of course, the real dystopian conclusion to that is articulated by Margaret Atwood in Handmaid's Tale, which is increasingly becoming real in Donald Trump's America. Finally, Tim, the politics of this, of course, are all important, bringing different peoples together, not just Camden Town or Berkeley, California, or New York, but agricultural communities, both rich and poor. Is there any room in the care economy for religion? Is religion perhaps, and the foundations of a certain kind of Christianity, might that be the philosophical foundations of the world that you're calling for, or is that the problem, or could it be both?
I think it could be a little bit of both, but I do think there's two really important things that are true in what you're saying. So the first, of course, most obviously perhaps, is that there has always been aspects of religious thought which have attempted to instill social values and love and care and altruism, concern for our neighbor, love thy neighbor as thyself in the second commandment in the New Testament. These aspects of religion, I think, have provided kind of what I would call social guardrails. They have provided a way to create this restorative force that brings us back into balance, not just physiological balance, but actually psychological balance. They've said to us, you are not just selfish human beings. Without altruistic behaviors, we would never have evolved. Without care, we would never have even existed. And so they've pointed us to a kind of fundamental truth about human existence, about our own potential. At the same time, of course, you could argue that religions have created conflict, partly by saying, my religion is better than your religion, and therefore this territory is better than yours, and therefore I belong in this world and you don't belong in that world. And the places where we've seen those conflicts, they've been actually horrendous. But there's another, and I think perhaps even more fascinating aspects of religious thought, which also comes into my exploration of care, which is, and it starts from the point where we say, yes, it's not just that we care for our physiological health. We also have to care for our psychological health. But what does that mean to care for our psychological health? What do we include in that definition of psychological health? And, it's many things. It's everyday level stability, the absence of depression. It's about our own sense of belonging and our sense of affiliation. It's about our sense of individuation. It's about our sense of meaning and purpose and having something to strive for in life. All of these things have something to do with psychological health. But they are also places, just as religion could go wrong by becoming a kind of territorial flag that you could fight each other over, so can some ideas about the pursuit of psychological health. So if, for example, if you think that caring for psychological health means that any individual has unlimited right to a sense of status and belonging and access to material things, and that's the basis of my psychological security, so I have every right to go out and strive for that. And very soon, of course, because so many people are striving for it, often in conflict with each other, you end up with the idea of domination, with aggression, and ultimately with violence. So you started with care for psychological health, but the route through which you pursue that psychological health led you back into the very opposite of care. And this, for me, was one of the most fundamental challenges in the book. It's the one that probably occupied me most when I was writing the book, that somehow the care economy could collapse into the growth-based economy if you allowed care for psychological health to justify this pursuit of status and belonging and domination and ultimately violence. You ended up right back where you started, with an aggressive, dominating, territorial, growth-based economics. And that's exactly the point where my principle of care as a restorative force comes back into play. It asks us to re-examine what that psychological well-being consists in. And in religious thought, of course, that psychological well-being consisted in beliefs about another world where everything would be good, everything would be fine, everything would be all right. And to some extent, our falling into this psychological model of psychological health, which is pursued through individual status, success, celebrity, dominion, and ultimately violence, is another prospect, a fallout from the relative collapse of religion. So when Darwin came along in the mid-19th century and essentially said, it's not just that we don't need God, there's actually no room for God in this wonderful universe that's being created through the power of evolution. And we then fell from that idea of a possibly quite naive religion into a sort of nihilism, the nihilism that accompanied the First World War, a sense of the lost generation, people searching desperately for some meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. And out of that, you could argue, we rescued ourselves with the power of consumerism, which was pointing to the glittering prize of an ever possible material cornucopia, if not for us, then at least for our kids. And that became our sort of goal for progress. And I think what the care economy and thinking about the care economy did for me, first of all, it made me realize that this pursuit of psychological health really, really matters. And the second of all, it made it clear to me that some forms of that pursuit, this pursuit of a status-driven individuality, is the opposite of care, because it is so disruptive and leads so quickly to violence. And the third thing it taught me, and this was, quite profound in a way, that if we're serious about the care economy, if we're serious about progress, if we're serious about a concept of psychological health that delivers us meaning and purpose, we actually have to go right back and look at some of those fundamental things again, things that religion tried to solve but failed to solve, things that consumerism arguably tried to solve but ultimately has failed to solve, and things that sit right at the heart of that sense of prosperity as health, our physiological health, our psychological health, and perhaps even something which we might want to call our spiritual health.
That's good stuff. The Care Economy. It's out in the US now by Tim Jackson, an important new book, bringing together so many themes that we talk about every day on the show. Thank you so much, Tim. And I hope it won't be another 4 years before we see you again. Lots more to talk about. I'd love to get your take, maybe on a future show, on the role of technology and AI and all this. So good luck with the book, and thank you so much.